It started with a knock on my door. Nothing dramatic, just a neighbor offering help. But somehow, that quiet evening unraveled everything I thought I knew about connection, about comfort, about myself. I wasn't looking for anything. But sometimes, the most unexpected moments change us forever. The evening had settled gently over the quiet street, casting long shadows through the half-closed blinds of Miles Whitaker's living room. The soft hum of his space heater filled the silence as he curled his fingers around a warm mug, the scent of chamomile rising in lazy swirls. It had been one of those uneventful days that seemed to melt into the next. Hours spent at his desk, sketching storyboards for clients who rarely knew what they wanted until they saw it drawn. He lived alone now. The house, though modest, had a kind of weary charm. Books lined the walls in no particular order, and a few of his own framed illustrations leaned casually against the fireplace. He hadn't bothered to hang them after the divorce. Somehow, putting nails in the wall had felt too permanent. That night, as he moved to place his mug on the side table, a dull ache in his shoulder reminded him of the injury he'd picked up weeks ago, a stupid moment involving a slipping grocery bag and a reflexive grab that ended poorly. He'd ignored it as long as he could. It was manageable. Or at least, it had been. The knock on the door was soft but distinct, not urgent, not loud. Just enough to cut through the stillness. Miles frowned, unsure who it could be. He rarely had visitors, and certainly not this late. He set down the mug and made his way to the door, opening it with a slow, cautious hand. Standing there was a man he'd seen once or twice, on the stairs, maybe at the mailbox. Slightly younger, dark hair tucked beneath a knit beanie, and a jacket dusted with the last remnants of rain. His smile was quiet but steady. He introduced himself simply, Calder Ruiz from 2 floors down. Mentioned he was new to the building, just settling in. Then his eyes flicked to Miles's left shoulder, which he hadn't realized he'd been subconsciously holding stiff. Calder's voice was calm, measured. He explained that he worked as a physiotherapist, mostly with athletes and post-surgical patients. Said he didn't mean to intrude, but he noticed the tension, and if Miles ever needed advice or stretching tips, he'd be happy to help. It was such a mundane offer, really, but something in the way he said it felt different. Not professional, not rehearsed, just human. Miles thanked him with a quiet nod and almost closed the door. But something stopped him. A flicker of instinct, perhaps. The sense that this evening didn't have to end in solitude. He stepped back, opened the door wider, and gestured inside. The invitation was wordless, and so was Calder's acceptance. They moved through the living room with an unspoken ease. No small talk, no formalities, just the sound of footsteps and the occasional rustle of fabric as Calder removed his coat and took a seat at the edge of the couch. What followed wasn't dramatic. Calder asked if he could take a look, just assess the tension in the shoulder. Miles agreed with a quiet hum, sitting beside him, angled slightly. Calder's fingers were sure and warm, pressing gently through layers of tension that Miles hadn't even realized had built up. The room was filled with stillness, only broken by the occasional breath or the creak of leather under their weight. It wasn't intimacy in the conventional sense, but there was something grounding about the touch. Intentional, professional, yes, but also caring. Miles found himself focusing less on the ache and more on the way Calder moved, how he paused before shifting pressure, how he occasionally glanced at Miles's expression for any sign of discomfort. The moment stretched, soft and quiet. There were no confessions, no dramatic turning points. Just two people in a room, breathing the same warm air, allowing space for something unspoken to emerge. Eventually, Calder leaned back, nodding slightly as if confirming something to himself. He mentioned a few stretches, suggested alternating heat and cold, and recommended not letting it go untreated too long. Then he stood, retrieving his coat, not in a rush but with a sense of purpose. Miles walked him to the door. No promises were made, no plans discussed. But as Calder turned to leave, he paused, just for a moment, and offered a final glance. A look that lingered a second too long to be casual. When the door closed, the room felt different. Not fuller, exactly, but altered, as if the stillness had shifted into something more alive. Miles sat down slowly, reaching once again for his cooling mug. The pain in his shoulder remained dull and persistent. But beneath it, a different feeling stirred. Not quite hope, not quite curiosity. Something in between, undefined, but no less real. And for the first time in weeks, the silence no longer felt like a weight pressing down. It felt like the beginning of something. The following days passed with the gentle rhythm of habit. Miles returned to his illustrations, answering emails, completing commissions, and drinking too much coffee while the city outside moved through shades of gray and drizzle. Yet underneath the regularity, something subtle had shifted. The quiet no longer felt the same. There was a new layer to it now, not loneliness, but a kind of awareness. A waiting. It wasn't just the memory of Calder's visit, though that lingered. It was the feeling it left behind. The silence they'd shared had been unlike any other. Not awkward or strained. It had been a silence that allowed space for presence, a kind of wordless understanding that didn't demand explanation. And somehow, that stayed with Miles longer than he expected. A few evenings later, the knock came again, this time more confident, a rhythm that sounded almost familiar now. Miles opened the door, and there he was, Calder, holding a thermos and wearing the same navy beanie, slightly crooked as if placed in a rush. There was no elaborate reason for the visit. Just a mention of extra soup he'd made and thought Miles might want some. They sat together on the same couch, legs angled, bodies relaxed, soup warm in their hands. The conversation was light, scattered, more about the weather than anything else. Calder spoke of his new clients, older patients mostly, and Miles nodded, listening, letting the sound of another voice fill the room. There was something about Calder's presence that softened the edges of the space. He didn't fidget. He didn't fill silence with unnecessary words. He simply was, grounded. And Miles found himself wanting that stillness more than he cared to admit. At one point, Calder offered to show a few shoulder mobility tricks, nothing too formal. They moved to the floor, rug beneath them, furniture casting long shadows in the low evening light. Calder knelt beside him, demonstrating gentle arm circles, subtle shoulder rotations, a stretch that leaned into the ache without forcing it. His hands found Miles's again, steady, assured. The touches were instructional, but there was care in them, the kind that didn't have to be spoken to be felt. Each motion was followed by a pause, a glance, a check-in that didn't require words. And through all of it, that quiet tension remained, humming beneath the surface like an unplayed note. When they returned to the couch, the tone had shifted slightly. The conversation slowed. The space between them shortened, not by movement, but by presence. A silence settled again, not uncomfortable, but dense with meaning. They sat side by side, their arms brushing lightly when either shifted, even slightly. Miles became acutely aware of the way their breathing had aligned, how their gazes sometimes met and then looked away, only to return again with soft insistence. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't anything so overt. It was curiosity layered with restraint, a mutual noticing. The night deepened around them, and the room grew dimmer. Neither of them moved to turn on the lights. They simply sat, watching the glow from the street lamps drift across the windows, watching the steam curl from the mugs, letting the silence do what it needed to do. At some point, Calder stretched his legs, brushing lightly against Miles's knee. The contact was brief, almost unintentional, but it lingered. Not physically, but emotionally. It created a ripple, a moment of clarity amidst the fog of routine. Miles didn't pull away. That detail stayed with him long after Calder left. There'd been no dramatic exit, no long looks at the door. Just a soft thank you, a smile that didn't try to hide anything, and a final glance that seemed to ask a quiet question without demanding an answer. When the door clicked shut, Miles remained on the couch, unmoving. The warmth from the soup had faded, but something else had settled in its place, a kind of expectancy, not of what would happen next, but of the possibilities that now hung in the air between them. There were no conclusions, no declarations. Only the echo of silence, shared and not shied away from. In the days that followed, Miles kept returning to that stillness. How full it had felt, how safe. It wasn't about the gestures or the touch. It was about the permission to exist beside someone without explanation. And in that, something delicate was beginning to grow. Something unspoken, but real. By the time the third visit happened, there was no pretense. No soup, no shoulder check-ins. Just a quiet message on Miles's phone. If you're free tonight, I could use a change of scene. There was no hesitation in Miles's reply. The hours that followed moved slower, as if time was aware that something subtle was beginning to shift. The evening had a softness to it. Rain tapped against the windows with no urgency, and the familiar scent of jasmine tea floated through the apartment. Calder arrived wearing a sweater instead of his usual jacket, the fabric slightly damp at the cuffs. He shook the rain from his hair with a quiet laugh, not loud enough to echo, but enough to change the air in the room. They settled on the couch again, not quite side by side, but closer than before. Their knees nearly touched. The space between them had shrunk in a way that felt natural, unforced. The conversation flowed easily, dipping into shared stories about childhood summers, favorite books, the quiet things people rarely bring up early on. There was no need to impress. No performances. Just the comfort of mutual presence. Miles noticed how Calder's fingers absent-mindedly traced the edge of the mug he held. He noticed the way Calder listened, not with nods or affirmations, but with stillness, with the kind of attention that made words feel valuable. And in turn, Miles found himself speaking more freely than he expected. As the evening stretched, their laughter faded, replaced by silence once again. But this silence felt heavier than the ones before. Not burdensome, just full, loaded with something unspoken. Miles leaned back, his eyes scanning the familiar objects in his living room. The books, the framed sketches, the shadows crawling slowly along the wall. Calder mirrored his movement, shifting subtly, their shoulders nearly brushing. The space between them became a thread, not quite a line, not quite a gap. A breath held, a question waiting. It wasn't about physicality. Not yet. It was about permission, about possibility, about the tension that hums in the space just before a decision is made. Not because it must be, but because it's been circling quietly, waiting for acknowledgement. Miles's hand rested on the couch cushion between them. Calder's hand was nearby, close enough to notice, far enough to ignore. Neither moved, but the awareness was loud. Loud enough that it drowned out the sound of rain, of tea cooling, of time ticking. There was no conversation to fill the silence. Just a shared pause. When Calder finally shifted, it was small, a tilt of his knee toward Miles's, a brush of fabric against fabric. The contact was so slight it could have been written off as nothing. But neither of them pulled away. Miles didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. What could be said in a moment where everything was both fragile and electric? Calder's gaze found his, soft and steady. A glance, then a second. The kind of look that didn't ask for permission but didn't demand it either. Miles felt his pulse in his fingertips, in his throat. Not fear, not exactly, but anticipation. The kind that makes the world go quiet inside your chest. And yet, nothing happened. No touch, no kiss, no confession, just the acknowledgement that something had shifted, that the space between them wasn't just physical anymore. Eventually, Calder stood, slowly. Not because it was late, not because the evening had ended, but because staying any longer might have tipped the balance too far. He offered a faint smile, the kind that knew too much and said too little, and walked to the door without looking back. Miles didn't follow. He sat there, still, his hand resting exactly where it had been. After the door clicked shut, the silence returned, the real kind. Not the shared one, not the safe one, just absence. But in that absence, there was a trace of something else. The echo of almost. The warmth of proximity. The understanding that the distance between them had changed, even if it hadn't closed completely. And for the first time in a long while, Miles didn't feel alone in his solitude. He felt watched over, not literally, but emotionally, as if part of Calder had remained in the room, sitting quietly beside him, filling the space with silent reassurance. That night, he didn't sleep much, not because of restlessness, but because of stillness, because his mind was full, not of noise, but of presence, of gestures that meant more than words, of nearness that didn't require touch to be felt. The rain returned 2 nights later, heavier this time, not a gentle drizzle, but a steady rhythm that tapped against the windows and blurred the streetlights outside. The apartment was dim, lit only by a floor lamp casting a soft glow over the bookshelves and the edge of the couch where Miles sat, a sketchbook untouched on his lap. His pencil had not moved in over an hour. He wasn't thinking about his project. He was thinking about the space beside him. The space Calder had filled just days ago. The closeness that had passed without words, but had left its mark in quiet tension and almost touches. When a knock came, it didn't startle him. Somehow, he had been expecting it. Not with certainty, but with hope disguised as intuition. He opened the door, and there stood Calder, his clothes damp from the rain, his hair sticking to his forehead in loose waves. He didn't smile immediately. There was something cautious in his eyes, as if unsure whether he should be standing there at all. He held no excuse this time. No bag, no container, no pretext. Just his presence, raw and quiet. Miles stepped aside without a word, and Calder entered, his shoulders slightly hunched against the lingering chill. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was aware. Every breath seemed to carry more meaning than words could hold. They moved to the couch like they always had, but tonight the distance between them felt smaller, more fragile. The air carried something electric, something neither of them dared name. The room was warm, but the space buzzed with anticipation. Minutes passed, maybe more. Neither of them reached for tea, neither asked about work, neither filled the room with anything but their breathing. And then, finally, Calder turned to face him, his eyes steady but unreadable. He didn't speak, but the way his gaze lingered, the softness behind it, the weight, said enough. Miles felt it then, in his chest, in his pulse, in the way his fingers tightened slightly against the cushion. Not fear, not confusion, but the sharp edge of desire held in restraint. A desire not just for touch, but for recognition. For the feeling that what had been growing between them was real, that it could be acknowledged without shattering the quietness that had made it possible in the first place. Calder leaned slightly, not close enough to breach the space, but enough to be felt, enough to test the air between them. Still, nothing was said. Miles's hand brushed against Calder's as he shifted. Not a grab, not even a full touch, just skin meeting skin for a breath of second. But neither moved away. The tension became a current, not oppressive, but undeniable. And then Calder spoke, softly, almost a whisper. A single sentence, a question not about the weather or his shoulder or the week they'd had. It was a question without specifics, but one that asked for something deeper. A silent invitation to acknowledge what had been simmering beneath the quiet for weeks. Miles didn't answer with words. He didn't need to. His eyes held steady, his body leaning just enough to close the gap. Their foreheads touched first, tentative and still. A breath passed, another. Then slowly, without urgency, their lips met, not with passion, but with gentleness, with care, with the kind of slowness that comes only when both know how fragile the moment is. It wasn't a kiss meant to ignite. It was one meant to confirm that something had changed, that this was not an accident, that two people who had carefully orbited one another had finally allowed their paths to meet. When they pulled back, neither moved far. Their hands remained close, their legs still touching, their breathing still shared. There was no explosion, no sudden declarations, just a moment suspended in stillness, quiet, real, and deeply human. And yet, behind the peace of that moment, a new tension crept in, not between them, but around them, a recognition of what had been crossed, of what now existed between them, of what couldn't be unseen or undone. Calder's gaze shifted to the window, to the rain outside. Miles followed it. The world was still moving, still raining, still unchanged. But for them, something was different now. Calder spoke again, a murmur barely louder than the rain, words that suggested caution, that hinted at the difficulty of the road ahead. He didn't move away, but he didn't move closer either. Miles nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. It wasn't time for answers. It wasn't time for next steps. It was only time to sit with what had happened, to feel it, hold it, and not rush to name it. They stayed like that for a long while. Close, quiet, changed. In the days that followed, everything remained outwardly the same. The city moved through its routines. Traffic lights blinked, mailboxes filled, and neighbors passed each other in the halls with polite nods. But inside Miles's apartment, a quiet shift had taken hold. Not a dramatic change, more like the aftertaste of something meaningful, soft, and lingering, present even when not directly spoken of. He hadn't seen Calder since the night they kissed, not because of avoidance, simply because life moved around them, as it always did. They had not made plans, not sent follow-up messages. And yet, the silence felt different now. Not the kind of silence that comes from distance, but one that waits patiently in the wings, knowing it hasn't been forgotten. Miles found himself moving through his days with a different rhythm. There was a softness in his thoughts, a calm where there used to be static. He wasn't sure what had changed exactly, only that something internal, something unspoken. When a message came, it was simple. A question, want to meet for coffee later this week? The kind of question that allowed space for anything, for conversation, for distance, for closeness, for nothing at all. Miles responded with quiet ease. Yes, Thursday works. They met at a quiet cafe on a residential street, tucked between an old bookstore and a flower shop. It wasn't a place people stumbled into by accident. It was chosen, intentionally quiet, intentionally safe. They sat across from each other in a corner booth, the table between them barely wide enough to create distance. The conversation began like all others. Light touches on ordinary things, work, neighbors, books. But beneath the surface, the thread from that night remained. Unbroken. Miles noticed how Calder's hand rested on the table, how it didn't fidget, how his fingers occasionally tapped the wood with an absent-minded rhythm. He noticed how Calder listened, as always, with full attention. Eventually, the conversation shifted, not in tone, but in weight. They didn't name what had happened. They didn't define it. They didn't label themselves or each other. Instead, they acknowledged what existed between them, that something had bloomed in the silence, had taken root in evenings shared without expectation. It was Calder who offered the idea first, that perhaps they didn't need to know exactly what they were doing or where it would lead, that maybe they could just let it be, let it grow or change or remain, without the pressure of making it into something it wasn't ready to become. Miles agreed, not with words, but with the gentle nod that followed. It was enough. They left the cafe together, walking in quiet synchronicity through the slow streets. Their hands didn't touch. Their eyes didn't seek too much. But the space between them felt familiar now, no longer loaded with hesitation. Just ease, just presence. Weeks passed, and with them came a new rhythm, slow, deliberate calm. Calder visited now and then, sometimes for tea, sometimes for nothing more than to sit quietly in the same room. There were days when they barely spoke, days when laughter filled the apartment, days when silence said more than conversation ever could. There was no urgency to define what they were to each other. No list of rules. No dramatic moments. Only small gestures. The way Calder's hand lingered on Miles's shoulder as he passed, or the way Miles waited by the window a few extra seconds after Calder left, watching until he disappeared from view. They existed in a space that wasn't quite romance, not yet partnership, but something deeply personal. Something that didn't require validation from the outside world. Something that lived in shared evenings, in exchanged glances, in the quiet act of choosing to show up. One evening, Calder arrived with no warning. No reason. Just a quiet knock and a small bag of oranges. They sat on the floor, backs against the couch, peeling fruit and trading stories about nothing in particular. The apartment was still. The world outside was asleep. And inside, something felt whole. At one point, their hands touched again, a brief graze as they reached for the same slice. And this time, neither of them moved away. It wasn't a kiss, wasn't a declaration. It was simply contact, gentle, known. Later, as Calder stood to leave, he paused at the door. There were no grand goodbyes, No promises of forever. Only a look. The kind that speaks quietly but means everything. After he left, Miles sat by the window, watching the lights of the street below flicker softly. He didn't feel alone. He didn't feel uncertain. What they had might change. It might deepen. It might fade. But it was real. It was honest. And for now, that was enough. Sometimes, the best stories begin not with certainty, but with a willingness to let something unfold, to leave space for possibility. And this, whatever this was, felt like the beginning of something worth holding on to.